November 24th, 1971, Thanksgiving Eve. Outside the rain-streaked windows of Northwest Orient Airlines Flight 305, the Pacific Northwest is being swallowed whole by a storm that feels almost biblical. Lightning fractures the sky above Portland. The wind howls like something wounded. And inside the narrow cabin of a Boeing 727, 36 passengers sit in blissful ignorance, thinking about turkey dinners and family reunions and the warm glow of holiday lights. In seat 18C, a man sits perfectly still. He is somewhere in his mid-40s. Dark suit, crisp white shirt, black tie, sunglasses. Indoors, at night, on a plane. As if the darkness is something he wears deliberately. He orders a bourbon and soda. He pays for it. He is, by every observable measure, completely unremarkable. Then he leans forward and presses a folded note into the hand of a flight attendant named Florence Schaffner. She tucks it into her pocket without reading it. A standard move. Passengers hand notes to flight attendants all the time, and they're rarely worth the paper they're written on. He watches her, waits. Then, very quietly, leans forward and says 6 words that will echo through history for the next 50 years.
Miss, you'd better look at that note. I have a bomb. By the time the sun rises the next morning, this man will have extorted $200,000 in cash from a major American airline, released 36 hostages without a scratch, given the FBI's finest investigators a masterclass in tactical precision, and then stepped off the back stairway of a moving aircraft into a freezing, pitch-black, 200-mile-per-hour void. He was never seen again. And the FBI? They never caught him. Not even close.
Here is what makes the D.B. Cooper case so uniquely, disturbingly fascinating. This was not the hijacking of a desperate man. It was not the act of an ideologue, a madman, or a political radical. There was no manifesto, no rage, no trembling hands. This was a performance, calm, precise, and almost surgically controlled from the very first second. When Florence Schaffner finally unfolded the note, she read a short, measured declaration. There was a bomb in his briefcase. He wanted her to sit down beside him. She did, and when she asked to see it, he opened the briefcase just enough, just a few inches, to reveal what appeared to be 8 red cylindrical sticks, a tangle of wiring, and a large battery. Then he closed it again, slowly, like a man who had all the time in the world. His demands were not the frenzied ultimatums of a cornered animal. They were a clean, numbered list. $200,000 in unmarked, negotiable $20 bills. 4 parachutes, 2 main chutes, 2 reserves. A fuel truck standing by in Seattle to refuel the aircraft. And a clear flight path to Mexico City. What he did next confounded everyone watching from the ground. He waited. While FBI agents scrambled to arrange the ransom and local skydiving shops were raided for parachutes, the man in 18C sat in his seat and chatted. He offered to pay for the crew's in-flight meals. He made small, pleasant conversation with the flight attendants, asking questions that were curious without being threatening. He was, by every account, genuinely likable. Florence Schaffner would later say he reminded her of a tired businessman on a long week, not a criminal holding an aircraft hostage at 30,000 feet. That psychological composure is crucial because anxiety is contagious, and so is calm. By projecting absolute steadiness, Cooper managed the emotional temperature of the entire aircraft. The crew didn't panic. The passengers, kept in the dark about the specifics of the situation, didn't storm the aisle. Everything stayed controlled. His control radiated outward like heat. At 5:39 p.m., Flight 305 touched down at Seattle-Tacoma Airport. In the fading gray light of a Pacific Northwest afternoon, a fuel truck rolled toward the aircraft, and a Northwest Orient representative climbed aboard carrying a canvas bag. Inside, $200,000 in 20s and 4 parachutes.
Cooper inspected them. He accepted the deal. He released all 36 passengers. Then he ordered the plane back into the sky. And this is where the psychology deepens into something almost chilling. Because the instructions Cooper gave the pilots for this second leg of the journey were not the guesses of an amateur. They were the specifications of someone who understood exactly what a Boeing 727 could and could not do. Fly at a maximum altitude of 10,000 feet. Keep the landing gear extended. Set the flaps at 15 degrees. Maintain an airspeed of no more than 170 knots. Leave the cabin unpressurized. Those parameters mean something very specific to anyone who knows aircraft. At 170 knots, with gear down and flaps extended, a 727 is flying at the absolute edge of its low-speed envelope, slow enough for a parachute jump, but still airborne. Unpressurized cabin means the aft air stair can be operated mid-flight without explosive decompression. And the aft air stair, the rear-facing stairway built into the tail of certain 727s, was a feature unique to that specific aircraft. It was designed for ground boarding at smaller airports without jet bridges. Cooper knew that. Not many people did. The FBI pilot who took over the investigation would later estimate that Cooper's knowledge of that aircraft's systems suggested either a background in aviation, military airborne operations, or both. He wasn't guessing. He had done the homework, possibly years in advance. The plane climbed into the bruised, storm-cracked sky above Seattle. The flight crew retreated to the cockpit per Cooper's instructions. A fighter jet escort tried to keep visual contact in the storm, and mostly failed. Somewhere above the dark, rain-soaked forests of southwestern Washington, a man in a black suit tied a money bag to his body, tucked a parachute to his chest, and walked to the back of the aircraft. Alone. Picture what he was actually stepping into. It is approximately 8:13 p.m. Outside the aft stairway, the temperature is somewhere near 0 degrees Celsius, and at altitude, with wind chill factored in, the effective temperature hits the body like a physical blow. The rain isn't falling so much as being hurled horizontally. The wind speed around the stairway, relative to the aircraft, is close to 200 miles per hour. Below, invisible in total blackness, lies the Cascade foothills, 60 miles of dense Douglas fir forest, rocky ridgelines, and glacial rivers that would be ice cold and running fast from the storm.
The pilots felt it happen before they saw any instrument evidence. A sudden, violent pitch-up of the tail section. The physics of a heavy object departing the aft stairs at speed. The cabin pressure shifted. A warning light blinked. Cooper was gone. What followed was the largest and most expensive manhunt in American aviation history. The FBI named it Operation Norjack, Northwest Hijacking, and threw everything they had at it. Military aircraft, Army ground troops, search dogs, divers searching the rivers and lakes of the suspected jump zone. They combed through hundreds of square miles of wilderness in the weeks following the jump. They found nothing. Not a shoe print, not a scrap of fabric, not a single bill from the ransom bag. The silence produced 2 irreconcilable schools of thought that persist to this day, and the truth is, both of them are built on solid ground. The FBI's official position was blunt. Cooper died that night, and their reasoning is difficult to dismiss. The man stepped into a freezing Pacific storm, wearing nothing but a lightweight business suit, a white dress shirt, and a pair of plain leather loafers. No thermal layer, no gloves, no helmet. The hypothermia risk alone, in those temperatures and conditions, was severe. At 10,000 feet in a 170-knot slipstream, the wind blast on impact with the air would have been disorienting at minimum and physically incapacitating at worst. And then there's the parachute. Out of the 4 chutes provided by the FBI,
Cooper selected one of the two main chutes, and the one he picked was, by an almost tragic stroke of irony, a non-functional training dummy. It had been sewn shut, its canopy stitched closed as a teaching aid for ground instruction. It could not open. If Cooper had deployed that parachute, he fell to his death. The FBI believes that's exactly what happened, and that the wilderness simply absorbed him, body, cache, and all, the way dense, old-growth forest eventually absorbs everything. But here's what the other side says, and why it has kept millions of people awake at night for 50 years. There is no body. No parachute canopy draped over a treetop, no bones, no belt buckle, no coin in a coat pocket. The wilderness keeps things. Hunters find remains in those forests. Animals scatter bones. Rain exposes artifacts that have been buried for decades. Yet after half a century of intentional searching and millions of amateur investigators combing the suspect jump zone on weekends, not one confirmed fragment of D.B. Cooper has ever surfaced. The believers point to a different profile entirely. What if Cooper was not a civilian in a suit? What if the suit, the sunglasses, and the businessman effect were a costume? A careful construction worn over the identity of someone trained by the United States military in airborne operations? An Army Ranger, or a Special Forces operator, or a combat-experienced paratrooper who had made low-altitude jumps in far worse conditions than a rainy Washington night? Someone who knew how to land in trees, navigate by stars, and disappear into civilian life as smoothly as he had disappeared into that storm? The two theories have coexisted without resolution for 5 decades. One says he died like a man who didn't fully think it through. The other says he lived because he thought it through better than anyone. Neither has ever been proven. For 9 years after the jump, the case produced nothing. No arrests, no credible sightings, no forensic breakthroughs. Cooper had become less a criminal investigation and more a ghost story. The kind that gets told in Pacific Northwest bars when the weather turns ugly. Then, on February 10th, 1980, an 8-year-old boy named Brian Ingram was digging in the sandy bank of the Columbia River, about 40 miles southwest of the suspected jump zone, near the small community of Tana Bog, when his fingers hit something wet and deteriorated and unmistakably strange. 3 small bundles of cash, their rubber bands still somehow intact despite nearly a decade of submersion. The bills were rotting, shredded by water and time, but the serial numbers were legible. The FBI ran them immediately. It was Cooper's money, specifically $5,800 of it, a little over 2.5% of the total ransom. The rest, all $194,000 plus, has never been found. The discovery raised more questions than it resolved, and the questions were vicious. If Cooper had drowned in the Columbia, why was only a tiny fraction of the money in one location? If the money bag had floated downriver from the jump zone, why was the rest of it not found along the same current? And if Cooper had buried this particular bundle, perhaps as some kind of insurance or by accident during a hasty camp, why walk away from nearly $200,000 and leave it in the mud forever? The Columbia River money remains the only confirmed physical evidence ever recovered from D.B. Cooper, and it solved nothing. With physical evidence exhausted, the investigation pivoted to suspects. Over the decades, the FBI formally investigated over 1,000 individuals. Most were cleared quickly, but 2 names have proved genuinely, stubbornly compelling. Richard McCoy. On April 7th, 1972, just 4.5 months after the Cooper hijacking, a man boarded United Airlines Flight 855 out of Denver, Colorado. He was well-dressed, he was polite, he had a bomb. He demanded $500,000 in cash and 4 parachutes. He ordered the aircraft on a specific low-altitude course. He jumped out of the aft stairway of a Boeing 727 somewhere over rural Utah. He landed safely. He went home.
He was arrested 4 days later at his house in Provo, where investigators found nearly $500,000 in cash hidden in a guitar case, along with a jumpsuit and skydiving equipment. His name was Richard Floyd McCoy Jr., Vietnam veteran, Sunday school teacher, father of 2, expert parachutist. And the physical resemblance to the FBI's composite sketch of D.B. Cooper was, by multiple accounts, striking enough to make investigators pause. The FBI investigated him hard for the Cooper case and officially cleared him. He had witnesses placing him at a Thanksgiving dinner in Utah on the night of the hijacking. But the detail that keeps independent researchers coming back is this. McCoy didn't just imitate the Cooper hijacking. He improved on it. He asked for more money. He planned a cleaner exit. He jumped in daylight, in better weather, over terrain he knew. It reads less like a copycat crime and more like a second attempt by someone who had identified the flaws in his first performance. McCoy was convicted of the 1972 hijacking, escaped from a federal prison in 1974, and was killed in a shootout with FBI agents shortly afterward. He died without ever being formally charged in the Cooper case.
Robert Rackstraw. If McCoy is the tragic soldier, Rackstraw is the carnival con man, and in some ways the more fascinating figure. Born in 1943, Robert Wesley Rackstraw was, by any measure, a remarkable piece of work. Army veteran, paratrooper, helicopter pilot, explosive specialist, and when the military was done with him, a serial fraudster, forger, and con artist who spent decades bouncing between aliases, fake identities, and federal charges across multiple states. When investigators first identified him as a Cooper suspect in the late 1970s, the biographical overlap was almost absurd in its neatness. He had the parachute training. He had the explosives knowledge. He was, by all accounts, extraordinarily cool under pressure. And he possessed the kind of improvisational intelligence that a crime like the Cooper hijacking demanded. But Rackstraw never confessed. What he did instead was something far more interesting. He performed. For decades, whenever journalists or investigators approached him about D.B. Cooper, Rackstraw refused to deny it outright. He would smile, he would deflect, he would drop hints that were just ambiguous enough to maintain deniability, while clearly enjoying the implication. He became a minor celebrity on the true crime circuit, appearing in interviews, speaking in riddles, reveling in the mythology he had either created or was simply borrowing for his own amusement. A team of independent investigators spent years claiming to have decoded a series of cryptic messages hidden in promotional material Rackstraw had allegedly distributed, messages that supposedly confessed to being Cooper in cipher. The FBI reviewed the claim and declined to reopen the case. Robert Rackstraw died in July 2019 at the age of 75 in San Diego. He died without confessing, he died without being charged, and he died with a smile that suggested he found the whole thing privately hilarious. The tie Cooper left on the plane yielded a DNA profile in 2001. It has never matched anyone in the FBI's database. His fingerprints, lifted from the aircraft, were similarly never matched to any known individual. Whoever Dan Cooper was, he existed outside the system, or had been careful enough to ensure that his real identity was never captured by it. In July 2016, 45 years after a man in a black suit stepped off the back of an aircraft into the dark and the rain and the void, the FBI formally suspended active investigation into the D.B. Cooper case. The file remains open, technically, but the agents have moved on. What they leave behind is the only unsolved case of commercial airline piracy in the history of American aviation. One discarded clip-on tie, a handful of rotting bills in the mud of a riverbank, a composite sketch that is stared down from post office walls and true crime documentaries for half a century, and a mystery so clean, so perfectly constructed, or so perfectly accidental, that it has outlasted every investigator who ever tried to crack it. Here's what we know for certain. A man boarded a plane. He was calm. He was prepared. He knew things about that aircraft that most people, most professionals,
didn't know. He executed his plan without violence, without chaos, and without a single moment of visible hesitation. And then, he stepped into a storm that should have killed him. Maybe it did.
Maybe the Washington wilderness holds his bones somewhere in a stand of old-growth fir, slowly becoming part of the soil, unknowable and unreachable. Maybe the Columbia took him, and the river kept it secret the way rivers do. Maybe the dummy parachute opened 6 inches and then collapsed, and it was over in seconds. A spectacular gamble that failed at the very last moment. Or maybe, and this is the thought that refuses to leave, maybe a man walked out of those woods 2 days later, soaking wet and half frozen, but alive. Maybe he caught a bus or a ride, made it back to some unremarkable life in some unremarkable city, and spent the rest of his years watching the news coverage with a private, quiet satisfaction. Maybe he died in a hospital somewhere in the 1980s or 90s, and the nurses never knew they were looking at the most wanted hijacker in American history. Maybe he's still alive, somewhere, very old, very patient, and completely invisible. We don't know. That's the truth. After 50 years, all the money, all the technology, all the obsessive investigation by both professionals and amateurs, we simply don't know. And that is exactly why this case will never die. So I want to ask you directly. You've heard the evidence. You've met the suspects. You've stood at the edge of that stairway and looked down into the dark. What do you think? Was D.B. Cooper a brilliant criminal mastermind who successfully beat the system? A ghost who walked away clean and lived out his days in freedom? Or was he just a desperate man at the end of his rope who committed the most spectacular and elaborate suicide in American history?